I don't think there's any one factor that is driving the increased support for Scottish independence. I think it's a multitude of factors. So firstly, Brexit has impacted this massively, and I think there's a kind of basic democratic principle there around, not just one, but kind of two countries in the UK voting to remain, and that not making a difference and they're being dragged out anyway. So there's a kind of democratic principle element to that. And then I think in terms of the actual process itself has really highlighted the imbalanced kind of nature of decision making and who has a seat at that table as well. If we look at things like, the scrutiny of trade deals, or even the kind of negotiation of the EU negotiation kind of outcome as well, that actually that for me anyway has highlighted that we didn't have a seat at that table. Devolved nations didn't have a seat at that table. That was a Westminster-led decision. And now, off the back of that, as we leave the transition period, regardless of what the outcome of that is, we are going to see, quite a fundamentally different economy. And I think, particularly because we know there is a lack of scrutiny in terms of the trade deals that we are actually going to get and how they go through Parliament and the kind of power that ministers have to sign off on those. And we saw that with the trade bill earlier on this year. For all the kind of talk of sovereignty and language really of nostalgia, given those that are propelling that agenda forward, I think what's more likely is that we're going to see an acceleration of some of the most corrosive elements of our current economic structure and our economic landscape. We're going to see a race to the bottom and deregulation. And we've already seen kind of warning signs of that around, for example, kind of some of the ideas floated around free ports as an alternative to the kind of current trading strategy and what that would mean for regulation, tax, workers' rights, supply chains, all of the kind of knock-on effects of that. And, centered at the heart of that ideology, that ideology has not sat well with the Scottish people. That is what, the kind of reaction to the Thatcher years and kind of the way in which that has, the legacy of those years and the kind of maintenance of that economic ideology that we're seeing today. I think that in and of itself will trigger kind of a kind of creeping support for Scottish independence. So I think there's Brexit as part of that. Another part of this is that Boris Johnson is very unpopular in Scotland. He is almost uniquely unpopular in terms of how people view him, more so than other Conservative figures. But he represents a brand of Conservatives and conservatism that does not sit well in Scotland. And I think if we compare and contrast that to the kind of polling figures of Nicola Sturgeon just now, that contrast becomes much, much clearer. And I think compounding that is the outcome of the 2019 general election as well. Kind of one of the key critiques of the union and the rationales put forward for independence is that we don't get the government that we vote for in Westminster. And I think that kind of added fuel to a fire as such, in terms of seeing again that we didn't get the government that we voted for, and kind of weren't even close in that regard, and got a government that was led by a figure who's very, very unpopular in Scotland, and a party that's very, very unpopular in Scotland just now as well. So I think the outcome of the general election really fueled that as well. And COVID-19 has had interesting impact on this too. Obviously this crisis has been handled quite poorly. We've seen that with the kind of scale of outsourcing of test, track and trace that simply just isn't working. And the people that have kind of profited off the back of that as well, while communities are struggling. But we've also seen a kind of imbalanced decision-making powers across the UK. Initially it was a four nations approach that they were going to try and manage this together, and that kind of fell apart. But we've seen kind of specific examples where this setup just isn't working. And I say that's true for Scotland. That's also true for, parts of the north of England that we've seen something similar happen there. But were Scotland to look to go into lockdown earlier this year, it would really have struggled to do so in a way that safeguarded jobs and incomes without an extension of the furlough scheme. Now, we have seen that since, but actually that kind of centralisation of power of something that's so crucial to tackling the virus and to kind of responding to it and to shaping the Scottish kind of policy landscape at that point of saying kind of what do we actually need to do here and what can we do here. And as I said, we saw that in areas of the north of England as well. We saw that with Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester, that actually this kind of centralisation of decisions being taken around kind of responding to and trying to combat COVID-19, actually there needs to be a mass decentralisation of decision making to have enabled that to work for communities the length and breadth of the UK. But we've seen the kind of internal market bill, which for me was really kind of troubling sign of things to come as well, in particular because, you know, we've gone from being part of the world's largest single market to negotiating trade deals on our own amid a time of economic downturn. And we're trading with partners that are much, much, much bigger than us as well. So kind of this narrative around like, we're going to get the best deal for Britain, for me, like the trade is a two-way street, and there's someone at the end of that street saying we're going to get the best deal for us too. And the best deal for them, you know, if we look to the case of the US, for example, the Biden administration has changed some of the dynamics of this, but not too profoundly, I think, particularly in areas like protection of the NHS. If Joe Biden is not willing to advocate a public universal health service for his own people, he's unlikely to seek to protect ours. And the impact of the kind of standard setting of the internal market bill, for me is very kind of troubling of that, is saying like, you know, we're going to embark on trade deals that you've got very little oversight of, that Parliament has very little scrutiny over. And we're trading with these much bigger partners. And I think there's a worry amid that the simply securing those trade deals will mean more than the details that are included in them. And I think that goes right back to the kind of broad restructuring of our economy. What will that mean for labour rights? What will that mean for climate and environmental protections? What will that mean for our regulations? In short, I think it's not any kind of one factor. I think there's a whole kind of compounding set of kind of triggers that are elevating the support for independence. But I've been thinking back to 2014 and the intervention that Gordon Brown made quite a lot recently about kind of the promise of the closest thing to federalism within the current devolution settlement, and kind of where we are now and here, and in terms of kind of seeing Brexit happen, but also the internal market bill, like what that does to kind of undermine the capacity of devolved governments. And that's not just true for Scotland. Like we saw outrage in Wales, Northern Ireland, and in the south of Ireland as well over the internal market bill and what that does to devolved administrations. And then kind of what we've also seen in terms of like a narrative level as well, of Boris Johnson saying that devolution has been a disaster. And there was a clip doing the rounds the other day of Jacob Rees-Mogg. I often struggle to interpret exactly what it is he's saying, but I think he was calling for devolution to, it sounded an awful lot like he was calling for devolution to be scrapped and to have something similar to kind of the early 1990s in terms of what the kind of constitutional settlement would look like in the UK. And that's just so far from where we were and what was kind of promised in 2014. And even though, you know, a lot of the kind of arguments for the UK weren't good arguments, they were arguments that were kind of like centered around, you know, capital flight or job loss. It's like it was negative arguments. Often like there was a kind of understanding of devolution in there that isn't true of today's UK government. And I think that's quite troubling, but I also think that's a massive own goal on their part. Like that's not where people are at. Like that's not what people are thinking right now. And kind of throughout all of this as well, it just feels like this sort of ramping up the campaign for the union is just so out of sync with the kind of demands of what people are actually kind of looking for just now, or kind of some of the key critiques that they have, like the idea that you would put, one of the ideas that was floated is like you put a Union Jack alongside your policies. Like, where are you going to put a Union Jack on the bedroom tax? Like, that's not going to work. Like, that's not that's not a good strategy. That's not what people are asking for. So it feels like, yeah, there's this real kind of layers of crisis that are escalating support for independence. And I think it's at the other side of that, there's a UK government that are not listening and are not in sync with what kind of some of the the concerns and anxieties that people have just now about the union. Like, they're not actually addressing those. They're putting Union Jacks on a vaccine instead, and it's not what anyone's asking for.